The foreign policy establishment. So within the United States, there is this foreign policy group of elites that make up what might be called a security bureaucracy. This is both within the government and without. These experts in foreign policy that all think within this range of opinion. They're not monolithic. There are different opinions, but there's large agreement on a consensus of a core few issues that are hardly ever challenged. So, for example, the question within is not whether we intervene in, whether it's a war or sanctions. It's how we intervene. Should we do it through sanctions? Should we do it through war? Should we do it through drones? And this foreign policy establishment is nicknamed the Blob. And the question I'm going to be looking at is why has it made U.S. grand strategy, that is the major overall strategy of the United States as a nation and how it behaves internationally, what the strategy is for that, why it's made that so difficult to change. And we'll look at those things. So the grand strategy, as I said, is the overall strategy of national interest in foreign policy. So it's the national interest of a nation in the international community. And the question we should be asking is, why has America's grand strategy not changed since the Cold War? So after World War II, the United States rose as the dominant power in the world. Europe was ravaged and destroyed by both World War I and World War II, and was being rebuilt. Britain has descended; it had lost its British Empire and had shrunk into decline at that point. And these great powers were largely decimated by World War II, and the United States rose to dominance. Now, obviously, there is still Soviet Russia, and the Soviet Union and communism comes to be the other major power during this time. That being said, the United States was still the most powerful, and what was created in international relations terminology is a situation of bipolarity, where you have two major world powers, states, that are, in this case, competing for the ultimate balance of power, which one is going to have victory. So the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1990, 1991. And again, the United States continued to entered the situation of a unipolar world. It's the only one. It's the only state of its kind in dominance. It arose as the singular, what's called hegemon, the really only power of that size and scale and geographic location and wealth. And so there's really no competition in security against the United States. However, the same strategy has continued to be pursued as if we were in the Cold War. The same amount of military spending and military intervention, and amidst mounting, crushing national debt. And why is this strategy not changed? Why has it not been scaled back? And there are many reasons for that, but there are barely any changes in U.S. grand strategy. Presidents after Reagan, so Reagan ends the Cold War, you have Bush #1, Clinton, Bush #2, Obama, and Trump. And Clinton talked about a more modest foreign policy. George W. Bush criticized nation building before 9/11 and referred to a humble foreign policy. Obama criticized the Afghanistan war, and Trump questioned Iraq and the Afghanistan war and all this spending on on foreign wars and intervention. That being said, despite some of those things, all of those presidents have fit comfortably within a range of foreign policy, uh, we'll say, options, and have not considered alternatives, or they've considered them, but then have not uh, actively pursued them. And what creates that situation? In an article, it's in International Security. It's a peer-reviewed academic article from Patrick Porter on this topic. Talks about why grand strategy has not changed. Now, how he explains it is power, habit, and that those are the two main reasons. And the article is linked here, but I'm going to be talking about some of those ideas. So, grand strategy for the US is the US pursues a grand strategy of primacy. Now, this is different from what, like Donald Trump would say, America first. So, the question is not whether America should consider its own interests first. International relations scholars, many of them agree one of the first things a nation does is focus on itself and its survival, and that's just what is. We're saying what should be, shouldn't be, but that's the reality. But primacy is different. Primacy is the idea of American leadership. You've heard it, America called the leader of the free world, or what might also be called hegemonic dominance. This idea of the United States dominating the international community in the sense of setting the agenda of whatever it decides to intervene in. I was going to say everything, but it picks and chooses things in which to intervene for this strategy of primacy. We're in a situation of unipolarity. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, as I said, the United States has occupied a unique position of unparalleled dominance as the singular superpower. Nobody comes close to it in military spending. Nobody comes close to it in economic wealth. Nobody comes close to it in military capacity. And we're also surrounded by two vast oceans and have unique geographic placement. So the United States, in many ways, there might have been an expectation of a scaling back after the security threat of the Cold War disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 and 91. However, as just one example, the Afghanistan war has had $5.6 trillion spent on it. There has been more money spent on the Afghanistan war than the inflation adjusted amount of money that was spent in the whole Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. And that's just Afghanistan. Why is there this seeming imbalance of strategy here, given the changing reality, the changed reality of the world? Well, it's because of this strategy of primacy that the United States seeks to, or the United States government and foreign policy establishment thinks within a range of opinion. And so that range of opinion is often not whether we should intervene or not, or whether we should change our foreign policy goals or objectives or habits. It's how much and to what extent should we do these things, be involved in these things. So the question of someone like Iraq in the 1990s, it's not should we not do this, should we do this? The question is actually more between should we bomb or should we use sanctions? That's more of the what would be seen within the blob of the appropriate range of discussion. It's very limited. So even after the Cold War, grand strategy has remained the same. Porter explains, and there could be many other reasons for this, but he explains that he believes it's because of power. The United States has economic size and military capabilities that are unparalleled in the rest of the world, making it tempting and easy to exercise that military dominance in the world and political dominance in the world thereby because of the military dominance. But power is not enough to explain it, because there were other times where the United States was had the opportunity or the possibility of being the most powerful to exercise that power, and it didn't do that. But he also explains a second idea of habit, and he explains this as collective ideas that come to seem obvious or axiomatic that lead to ignoring alternatives. So that's what a habit is, that these truths become the basis of the foundation of thinking, and they're hardly ever questioned. So it's a limitation on options or alternatives. He writes, these habits are perpetuated by a foreign policy establishment known as the Blob. The Blob comprises a class of officials and commentators who worry incessantly about the collapse of the American security order. So the idea is, if it's suggested of a more, as Bush said, humble foreign policy of scaling back some of those foreign policy commitments, as Bush suggested, as Obama suggested, as Trump suggested, all of them from their campaign. What's going to be heard from the foreign policy establishment is that that would lead to a collapse of the American security order. And this is from the commentators, and it's from those within the government and those within the think tanks. And it's all people that, though they may disagree on many other issues, have this limited consensus or this range of opinion. And so that's what the idea of the habit is, this perpetuation of habit. So the Blob emerged after World War II because of a demand for security expertise. Porter goes on, their commitment to primacy became an article of faith. So rather than just being what a strategy really is, a strategy is a plan of how to accomplish something. And if situations change, realities change, then the strategy changes. Then you question the strategy, or you reorganize the strategy, you reorder the strategy, you make a plan or an adjustment to the plan as an alternative. But the problem here is that the commitment to primacy, or U.S. grand strategy of primacy, becomes an article of faith. It says, as a grand strategy, primacy warrants scrutiny. It demands significant upfront investments, implicates national security and developments far and wide, and makes the United States prone to frequent use of force. So these are all heavy costs that come with this commitment to primacy. And he's not saying whether or not they should not pay those costs, but he's saying it should be a discussion. It shouldn't just be taken for granted as an article of faith that the United States must pursue this one option of primacy as its grand strategy, that alternatives should be considered, and the evidence for and against these things should be weighed and evaluated. The problem is primacy has become, within the foreign policy establishment that informs the U.S. people, it's become this article of faith that you don't question it, you just make decisions within that strategy. So this ideology then obviously constrains and limits foreign policy options. So alternatives to this strategy based on scaling back commitments are eliminated. So for example, Obama, Donald Trump both talked about getting out of Afghanistan, but they interact with this foreign policy establishment, the Blob, And it's all comprised of people who are of the consensus view of we can't do that because that's not within the grand strategy of primacy. So, and here's the result. That's what the result has been. Um, and so those any alternative strategies that maybe non-intervention, maybe a return to what's offshore balancing, get the troops out of the uh, mainland and have them balance from ships off the sea or bases off the sea, but not be in the country, which could, some international relations uh, experts think that that would be an option for viable for the Middle East, but you never hear about it because that's not in line with the strategy of primacy. And then this bureaucracy, the nature of a bureaucracy, which I could go on and on about economically and governmentally, the nature of a bureaucracy is to perpetuate the bureaucracy. It has very little incentive just by the nature of what a bureaucracy is. It has very little incentive to be responsive to outside influences. It's responsive to its budget and the natural incentive to want to expand its budget. Um, and bureaucracies are removed from the cost of their actions. Therefore, there's less at stake, causing a disincentive to count the costs, to do calculation, to do cost benefit analysis of these things. And so this is another case where a security bureaucracy and a foreign policy bureaucracy does the same thing. Porter says to say that habit drives U.S. grand strategy is to suggest that policymakers become unreflective and non-deliberative about the framework within which decisions are made. So notice the idea of there's a framework, and decisions can be made inside this framework, but in a very real way, you're not allowed to question the framework itself. And so he says that this leads to, in his opinion, um, people within that bureaucratic mindset, not that they're bad people necessarily, but people within that bureaucratic mindset to become unreflective, not to really think introspectively about these policies, decisions that they're making, and non-deliberative, meaning there's a limitation on deliberation, debate, back and forth, questioning of things. And this is what strengthens the habit of the foreign policy establishment. So after World War II, the United States rose to power, most powerful nation in the world. It began to enlarge its ambitions and has more of a desire to reorder the international system. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, obviously, there's a pretty chaotic situation of the World War, and that ending of the World War creates an opportunity for the United States to kind of reorder the system and uh, continue that power. Experts in Washington after World War II, instead of just viewing World War II as a victory, the United States had a part in winning World War II and came out victorious. Experts began to urge Washington political elites to translate that victory into what's called hegemony or dominance, to take the victory one step forward to that the victors now define the terms of the international order, and the United States needed to continue to pursue dominance over these other countries. Um, and then the idea was of a Washington designed world order. These foreign policy elites and political elites believed, many of them progressives and others just military careerists and other people within this mindset, believed that they could design a better world. And you can't fault them necessarily just for their intentions, but it needed a more than healthy dose of humility to realize that you can't just people are not human chess pieces, and nations are not just human chess pieces. That political science becomes automatically more complicated, and economics automatically becomes more complicated because the subjects that you're dealing with make their own decisions, which is different than biological science or geology, where things react and things happen, and it is um, there are changes and reactions, but the rock you're studying in geology does not make its own decisions as people do and as nations do and how they behave. And so and uh, conservatives get this domestically as people want to intervene, progressives want to intervene economically in the economy and the domestic economy and want to and don't recognize the difference between intentions and real consequences that happen economically. And conservatives don't get it internationally. They become interventionists in foreign policy and don't follow through that same way of thinking that that those intentions and consequences are not necessarily the same things. That interventions, just like interventions in the domestic economy, interventions in international foreign policy, can have unintended consequences. And the idea here was also for America to be the moral leader of the world, to take the place of Britain as kind of that dominant Western empire. Uh, and then it created a security bureaucracy. This is what is the beginnings of what is the foreign policy establishment, or the Blob. It became a cohesive foreign policy elite, and by cohesive, I mean, and I take that language from Porter as well, that people thought the same way with regard to a large grouping of topics. Now, they may have disagreed on minimum wage, they may have disagreed on abortion, they may have disagreed on all kinds of different issues, but on these larger questions in foreign policy, people all thought the same way. And it's not just because, well, that's the only way right thinking people think, but we'll see why that was built and maintained that way on purpose. They were united by this consensus. And then how does the Blob continue to reproduce this ideology? How do you end up with a foreign policy establishment where people all think the same way? But I would remind us that it's not where things are just neutral. Remember that there are interests involved in this as well. And there are interests in people thinking a certain way and choosing people who think a certain way. But let me read a lengthy quote from Porter on this and then talk about it a little bit. He says the Blob reproduces its ideology through four causal mechanisms. First, security elites accumulate knowledge about how grand strategy succeeds and form mental shortcuts that they repeat and internalize. Second, they socialize personnel into their worldview, educating and selecting individuals who conform, excluding or penalizing those who do not, and linking conformity to an axiomatic worldview with insider status. They also dominate the pool of experienced officialdom. They have privileged access to power via an institutional revolving door, a set of social networks and institutions, the locations where grand strategic ideas intervene at the unit level, between appointments in the government, through through to foundations, think tanks, universities, and bodies from the Council on Foreign Relations to the Trilateral Commission. New presidential administrations will often retain career security officials for the sake of continuity. As the cohorts of qualified officialdom are socialized into orthodoxy, even presidents who wish to institute change will be drawn to select from that pool. The Blob has close ties to corporate networks. Third, the Blob dominates public discourse and sets its agenda through privileged access to the commentariat, of which it forms a part. Presidential candidates routinely approach establishment figures at think tanks to formulate their foreign policy manifestos. They define the terms of debate, delegitimizing alternative strategies as alien and foolish, and they present alternatives to primacy involving retrenchment or avoidance of war in binary terms as retreat or isolationism. Fourth, they exert influence via via a transnational pathway, supplying allies and ideas with idea supplying allies with ideas that those allies repeat. Typo there, creating a feedback loop. So those four things are what Porter sees as the way grand strategy really develops. And really, let me just review them as I close out here. This is how the foreign policy establishment keeps this range of opinion. Number one, they assume there's the assumption of primacy presuppositionally. It's not allowed to be questioned. And then they repeat and internalize these ideas and they make the arguments for it over and over again. And they talk to the same people who believe what they believe. And so they repeat these truths. Two, they socialize people under the worldview. They educate, uh, and then select people who agree. And if people come in with alternative opinions, alternative ideas, alternative criticism to the mainstream view, those people are excluded from think tanks, they're excluded from government positions, they're ostracized socially, they have peer pressure put on them to follow it and fall in line with a certain point of view. And people are very open about this. This is a known thing. It's not some secret cabal where this is happening. The Blob acknowledges this, and people acknowledge that they've supported certain things because of this pressure, this social pressure. And then they exclude those who do not, and then they give government a group of appointees who all agree with consensus. So when presidents choose appointees, it's within this range, whether Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, whatever the case may be, they all choose within this range of acceptable people who have been socialized into this worldview of the Blob. They also dominate public discourse. So they set the agenda. So the question, you'll notice this on major media outlet, you'll notice this in major newspapers. The question is never, should we or should we not go to war with Iraq? Should we or should we not go to war with Iran? Should we or should we not? It's always within the context of the framework of primacy. It doesn't matter if the media outlet is liberal or conservative, or liberal pretending to be neutral like CNN, or whatever the case may be. The discussion on foreign policy is going to be largely the same, and anyone on those type of shows who discusses in an alternative point of view, from an example from the left, Tulsi Gabbard, or an example from the right, or the libertarian view of Ron Paul, anybody who criticizes the idea of primacy, interventionism, nation building, they're all given the same script. So, for example, CNN doesn't like Donald Trump, right? That's not a surprise. CNN has a rabid hatred of Donald Trump, but and this clip can be found online easily. Fareed Zakaria, who's a foreign policy expert, as soon as Trump made the decision to bomb Syria, CNN began to praise him. Zakaria said, "I think this is the moment where Donald Trump has just become president." This was on CNN. Tulsi Gabbard, a leftist, liberal, um, but someone who consistently questions interventionism and criticizes American foreign policy, was on, I don't know, it was a late night comedy show, but it was being given the same lecture, same talking points about uh, these same ideas. Uh, Fox News, Ron Paul, same lecture about this language of delegitimizing alternatives as foolish, crazy, unrealistic, using words like retreat. We don't retreat from these things, or isolationism. Using these buzzwords against people who disagree. And that's what you'll see on all the media outlets because they're part of this foreign policy establishment. They're part of that commentariat. And then internationally, these experts are supplied in international discussion to kind of create this feedback loop, to have others in other countries who say these same things, who use these same talking points. Um, so these beliefs and commitments uh, cause people to delegitimize arguments for restraint, for prudence, for non-interventionism, for peace in general. And policymakers interpret disasters as proof of insufficient government power and arguments for greater U.S. dominance. So, for example, close with this quote from Porter. So, after 9/11, instead of a reevaluation of foreign policy and blowback and the effects of interventionism in the Middle East for decades, it was taken as uh, we're not following this strategy of U.S. dominance enough. Porter says it predisposes policymakers to interpret disasters, such as the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, as caused by an insufficiency of U.S. dominance as evidence for the need for more.